if wokeness is a kind of hyper aggressive imposition of leftist mores on ordinary expression, then I guess the woke right is just the people who have now taken some sort of power or authority, imposing their own preferences, more or less in the same way.
This is Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian What News? The Canadian Jewish News. Would you believe it? When I first moved to Canada from the States in 2015, I was not a Canadian citizen yet. I only became one in September 2023, and it never occurred to me during those years to worry that I had different speech rights than citizens. I think if I had thought about this, I probably would not have entered into a career in punditry, such as it is, if you could call it that, writing columns, doing podcasts. It did not occur to me that citizens would have different speech rights and non-citizens. And the only time I thought about this at all, the first time I thought about this at all, was nothing to do with Canada, totally to do with the United States and to do with the second Trump administration's crackdowns on, at first, pro-Palestinian speech from people living legally in America, but not U.S. citizens, and more recently, a different type of speech that we will be discussing on the podcast today, speech insulting to a violently killed pundit in the States. So basically, this personal story that I've told in a very windy way is just to lead us into our topic today, which is free speech, Canada versus the U.S. Where is speech freer? What's up with free speech? Is it everybody's top goal, actually? To have us make sense of all of this is our first ever return guest on The Jewish Angle, David Polansky. David is an American writer and political theorist in Toronto, and I really enjoyed his article for the Washington Examiner on the altar of content neutrality. So, David, welcome back to Jewish Angle.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So where is speech more free, would you say, the U.S. or Canada? You have experience of both.
Oh, it's still the U.S. I think that it's more apparent when you see the crackdown, just because everything in the U.S. is lit up with, quite bright, big neon lights. So anytime anything happens, it's very much in our face. But for example, a guy was it yesterday or the day before, some fellow out, I think in like North Bay, a place I've never been, I'm not sure anyone's ever been, was convicted, sentenced to like 9 months or something for posting stuff about anti-Jewish stuff online and Holocaust denial. That would never happen in the States. Unless it were linked to some sort of like concrete threats or something like that. As far as I know, that was not the case here. This was basically being a kind of punishment for hate speech. That wouldn't happen in the States. Obviously, Great Britain is a little further, it's quite a bit further down this track as far as actual government clamping down.
Right. Does Canada ever have the thing where somebody does a bad tweet and then the police come to their house?
I haven't heard of anything like that. The UK is definitely further along that track. The question is, as I'm not just on this point, but on a lot of points, you start to wonder, okay, but really, what are the rails on this thing? What kind of safeguards? Once you start pushing on it, what actually is there to prevent free fall on questions like this?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of there's like the legal and practical differences, because there's the Charter versus the First Amendment, which would make it seem on paper certainly like speech is much more free in the States. But then I started thinking, like, if you zoom out, guns make it less free in certain respects in the States because, like, as happened with Charlie Kirk, you could get shot while saying something somebody doesn't like. It's not the government cracking down on your speech, but it is the rules of the country you're in inhibiting your speech, potentially. Like, if you're scared, let's say you're an educator of some sort and you're scared that if you say the wrong thing, there will be a school shooting, Like, there are all sorts of ways that could come up. And also I was thinking, though, about healthcare, that if you're worried, like, it's the same in the States and in Canada, that if you're fired, you lose your income. But if you also lose your health insurance, you're much more tied to your specific job. So do you think that matters at all in terms of assessing these?
Yeah, I think it matters. I don't think I don't think speech as such, but I tend to think of it more as a cultural matter than as an institutional one, just insofar as, I mean, it's not so much a question of like, okay, are there protections such that people will then say, I know that I can say this. Here's an example. Um, Coming out of academia a little bit, you think nobody should be freer in that respect than someone with tenure. I have met a lot of people with tenure. These are not the freest, bravest, most outspoken people. Um, they're timid little rabbits. Despite all of the institutional protections around them, that basically let them go out and say all kinds of crazy stuff. While making, and even if there's an investigation conducted or something, they'll probably still continue getting paid. You know,
Hmm.
so it's a pretty great setup. And yet the issue there isn't institutional or contractual protections; it's culture. They have been acculturated to, they've spent their entire careers getting to this point by not rocking the boat. They're not going to start now. And I think
Yeah.
you can kind of zoom out from that to sort of think, what kind of culture do you have, both institutionally and then more socially and broadly, around ideas of free expression? I tend to think that probably matters more than these sort of rational choice calculations of, if I say X, well, Y happened to me. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm. Yeah, that does make sense, and I think gets at why the legal censorship aspect is scarier than people will shun me in a certain sense, but also they're not as different necessarily as all that. But I also wanted to talk just for a moment about like the bubble legislation in Canada, which I had always thought of as something that doesn't exist in the US. But then there was this September 29th Reuters article, and I'm quoting from it. It says the US Justice Department is suing pro Palestinian organizations and demonstrators it accuses of intimidating Jewish worshippers at a New Jersey synagogue using a US law that has traditionally been used against people blocking access to abortion clinics. End quote. So I was thinking, like, is there basically the potential for bubble legislation in the States?
One thing that, I mean, I will say the Supreme Court's been pretty good on, has been pretty united on this as far as being, across the political spectrum, as far as being pretty protected free expression. I have a hard time seeing how this comes out. I mean, the mere fact that you see a Justice Department doing that, that's going to have a chilling effect for sure. It doesn't strike me as legit. And I mean, and none of the bubble stuff. I don't think any of the bubble stuff was legit. I think it's a bad way to deal with the problem.
In
Could
Canada as well?
Yeah, I think it's
Mhm,
about, and I
mhm,
would not say there isn't a problem. There is a
mhm,
problem. I know there's a problem because, for example, I drive my kid to the JCC, for basketball or something, and I get to see, the morons protesting out there and waving flags and all kinds of stuff, despite the fact that they're nowhere near a consulate. Uh, there's obviously attempts to sort of get into intimidation. So it's not that there aren't problems to deal with. And then and we're in the States too, in terms of the way that certain radical, or even if you don't want to call them radical, you could just say awesome, the way that certain awesome political movements, if you like them, but have been allowed to sort of take over the normal public square in a way that does, I think, interfere with people's ability to just use these institutions and use the public square and and just live their lives in normal ways without somehow, having to deal with the question of Palestine, for example.
mhm,
So there definitely is a kind of prior abuse of the public norms that then triggers this sort of reaction. One of the ways the reaction comes out is this sort of bubble legislation, or roundabout way of enforcing a bubble legislation. But the bubble stuff is definitely bad. I don't see how that passes muster.
mhm, mhm. So I wanted to also ask about, and this is the part where we can go on forever. We won't, I promise, to you and to our listeners. But the woke right, the woke right. If I know what you mean, what does it mean?
I hate these terms. I hate these terms. I mean, in theory, it's just simply if wokeness is a kind of hyper aggressive imposition of leftist mores on ordinary expression, then I guess the woke right is just the people who have now taken some sort of power or authority, imposing their own preferences, more or less in the same way. So instead of saying, oh, that was a microaggression, or oh, you can't say these words, it's you can't say this about Charlie Kirk, for example.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I want to spell out for listeners what this is. So basically, in the 2010s, there was this whole cultural movement with some institutional backing, but not like what we're looking at now, to crack down on problematicness. Basically, that was a lot of the time, I think, coming from within the left, within the liberal left, sort of, like a progressive who did a misstep, right? And it seems like maybe now what we're looking at with this sort of from the right speech crackdowns, it doesn't seem to be the same sort of internal purity policing. Is that a possible distinction?
Yeah, although it's also true that historically the left has tended to consume its own anyway. If you look at the history of a lot of leftist movements, there tends to be a great deal of fratricide. Uh,
Sure, sure. I mean, I think what came to happen though in the 2010s is it wasn't just like these individual leftist groups, splintering off into, the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front. It was more like you can't, like, I mean, the example I'm always thinking of is like, you can't be the editor of Teen Vogue if you did a bad racist tweet when you were 17 years old, even if you're a Black woman yourself. And I'm not like, this is an actual example from
well,
that
what?
time.
Yeah, no, I think that about sums up the kind of that's a pretty good synecdoche for the past 6 years or whatever, however many years it's been. But I think Musa Al-Gharbi's book is probably useful. He's argued, okay, we've never been woke, and he sort of looks at this phenomena as a sort of a kind of status striving within these sort of nominally progressive institutions. So, for example, as you said, it's not leftist taking down rightist; it's leftist taking down people who aren't who are liberal. For example, the editor of the New York Times or what have you.
Hmm.
Um, in a kind of interpret, that's something like an internal coup. And one way to think of it is just that these these institutions were already in some ways sort of progressively oriented, and that exposed them to these kinds of dynamics from ambitious or sociopathic strivers, who could take, it's sort of like what you see during civil wars. You think, oh, that guy took, one guy took another guy out. You think, oh, they must have really hated each other ideologically. No, they were actually romantic rivals, or they had
Hmm.
a long standing vendetta, and then this political or cleavage created an opportunity for the one person. And I think something like that does happen, and like in Teen Folk, the editor was standing in your way. How can you get the editor out? And this became a way to do that, and that dynamic just
Well,
doesn't
she
exist.
never actually even became the editor, as I recall. It was like the to be. She was about to become the editor and never did. But yeah, the point totally stands. I mean, the way I understand that era, and this is getting into the weeds a bit, is that like with the like 2008 recession, with this sort of when all these prestige job when like there were a lot of things that weren't prestige jobs that kind of became that anything that had anything to do with the arts or writing or any media in any capacity switched into this kind of like unpaid internship glamorous zone. Everybody who was interested in these types of jobs was fighting for what seemed like scraps. And there was just this tremendous interest in saying that whoever had won one of these rare positions got there unfairly and that it was unearned privilege. And you saw this very early on with these campaigns against people who objectively did not have that much unearned privilege, like the Lena Dunham being the obvious example where she was supposed to be this like beneficiary of nepotism and wasn't really. And then there was even more extreme and earlier was Tavi Gevinson. Do you know who this is? You're not going to know who this is.
Remind
Okay.
me.
And she was this like tween fashion blogger. Now she's, I think, an actress, and she founded Rookie Magazine, this magazine for sort of precocious teenagers. And people talk about her privilege. Her father is like a Chicago school teacher. Um, and there was just this big movement to say that you're not jealous of the person who won. It's the systems. It's systematic, right? Or it's systemic, rather. It's systemic. And I feel like that's kind of what got us to that place, maybe. And then, yeah, I don't think that's why I'm wondering about the connection. Like, so something I really like in your piece for the Washington Examiner, I'm going to quote, right, about the 2010s type cases. Okay, what links these otherwise dissimilar cases besides their silliness is that they all involved conventional things. They became controversial only at the moment of controversy. And I think, sorry, end quote. And I think that's really true, that like people were being canceled for things that you had to explain it. And if you even look back at it now, it's like, what was going on? And it just seems bizarre. Whereas now, it's it's not that people are being canceled for, and in my view, for any more reasonable reason. It's just you can explain what's happened. Like if somebody said something mean about Charlie Kirk and they're being punished for that. Do you think that's different or not? Like you
I do.
could. What do you think?
No, I do, and I think because in a sense that it's more political and less ideological. I mean,
Hmm.
what you were getting at is the way that, no one could come out and say, "I envy this person, so I'm going to destroy them." And that's what ideology is good for that. Ideology allows us to mask ordinary vices, by kind of filtering them through, our particular commitments. Um, I don't see that kind of ideological kind of dynamic as much here. Here it is, I think, more of an object level question of like, okay, well, someone celebrated someone else's death, or even possibly did it in a way that opened the door to potentially welcoming future violence. How should we feel about that? I think that is a better discussion to have.
Hmm.
Regardless of where you fall on it, that to me is just a more substantive thing than, as you say, these sort of, you know, the, you know, basically non-controversial problems that, then got erupted into controversy because of various, other motivations within, particular institutions that were increasingly, in which jobs were becoming increasingly scarce.
So you have examples in your article. Do you want to share what some of the more colorful ones?
Which the right ones or the left ones?
Maybe does it start with the left chronologically?
Well, I mean, the ones that come to mind were, things like, a guy, I think one guy who was literally like a rocket scientist and, he was on a cat, he was on a thing and someone notices he was wearing a somewhat off color shirt, with like women on it. And they were like, what the hell is this? And so, this guy who was clearly on the spectrum and probably had no idea what he was wearing was,
Well,
was
do we know that he was on the spectrum, or you're meaning it in the colloquial sense, or
possibly both. I'm actually not sure. I mean, he seemed like an odd guy. That's
okay?
particularly
I'm just saying
nasty.
we cannot diagnose via podcast.
I cannot die. I should stress, I am not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV.
Okay, okay,
I'd say
fair
he's the
enough, fair
kind of
enough.
guy X years ago,
Yeah,
he was like, he's like this kind of
yeah,
offbeat scientist guy.
yeah,
Who like
yeah,
not the kind of guy who thinks a
yeah.
lot about the shirt he's wearing, but the kind of guy who
Sure.
thinks a lot about rockets. So, so he of course is forced to make this sort of, humiliating apology after having, what should have been like a great moment for him, going on TV talking about some scientific achievement he had. When Mr. Potato Head. I mean, just a variety of fairly ridiculous things that suddenly were seen as, no, we can't do this anymore.
What I'm trying to do on this podcast, this particular one, and just the show generally, is try to connect the 2010s to what's happening now and try to make sense of, like, trying to piece it all together, right? And I think a few, like, you can tell me if you think I'm onto something with this or not, but like, one thing that happened is it did give this impression of, as a different Justine Bateman would put it, like walking on eggshells, you know? So even if there wasn't materially a huge chance of any individual getting canceled for being problematic, a
Yeah.
lot of people felt this kind of, you can't say anything anymore. And the people who felt this were not all straight white men. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people would come to feel this. But then I was thinking that another connection is this way that basically progressives kind of lost whatever upper hand they may have had in terms of being the people who support free speech, right? So, like, I think what I've seen now is a lot of people saying, "Oh, how terrible the right is cracking down on free speech," who perhaps, like, who may not have positioned themselves as big advocates for free speech a few years ago. And I feel like that may have weakened sort of the liberal left area of the spectrum's kind of upper hand on this issue. Am I onto anything with this?
Yeah. I mean, well, I think rhetorically, there's not much of a leg to stand on. not even not in this, because it's not just the people who maybe actively participated in these sorts of, mob cancellation type things, but also just the ordinary type, New Yorker writer types who maybe didn't go as far, but also would never have criticized anyone to their left and would sort of make these kind of, well, we have to hear both sides. I mean, they allowed the door to open. And they would hire people. I mean, the example I use in the article to me is someone like, Karen Attiah, who was recently let go from the Washington Post. I mean, for years, she was given free reign to write
Do you want to
fairly
explain a
informative.
bit about who she is, just since
Yeah,
it's
she was an
Canada?
op she was a columnist, for the Washington Post. This is within that kind of, talking about the prestige. This is probably one of the more prestigious positions you might find in the journalistic world. This is a paper with some real, influence. And she was a Black female writer, so she had a certain profile. And she, for years, I mean, would write fairly extreme stuff. After 10/7, she basically, she was reposting, she would retweet some of the really crazy stuff people were saying then about basically celebrating the violence.
Right, I don't
You
remember
know,
whether it was that she had liked or retweeted.
she retweeted it, I
Oh, she
remember.
did, okay, because it was
So,
definitely the one about, it
it
was
was
that famous
notorious,
one. The
notorious. What do you think
Yeah.
what do you think your resistance was? Vibes, papers, obviously meaning like the resistance is murdering people, which it is, or at least it was then. And and also she, I mean, she wrote a lot of stuff. So, for example, at one point back when the term Karen was going around, basically a kind of a slur for, a certain kind of liberal white lady. And he wrote something basically saying, you're lucky that all we do is call you Karen. Given basically you deserve something you deserve actually something physical punishment, but you're only getting called a Karen. I thought that was a really crazy thing to write.
Were
And it
Karens supposed to be liberal white women? I thought Karens were
maybe they're not liberal. Maybe
yeah.
I think Karen is like someone who votes Democrat, but then like when the chips are down, she's walking.
Oh,
We'll
I
we'll we'll,
see. Okay.
we'll
Yeah.
prove to call the
Yeah.
cops.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I guess a Karen could be anyone. It could be any white woman of any political persuasion who calls the cops when they shouldn't. Is that
I guess, yeah, yeah.
These are one of the things that came out. And one of the things I wanted to kind of get at was it wasn't like everyone was walking on eggshells during the kind of extreme moments. It was certain people were walking on eggshells and other people really had free reign to say whatever the hell they wanted. So there was a kind of it wasn't like you have this kind of imposition of, a comprehensive norm of expression and conduct. What you had was, in the kind of animal farm kind of sense, like we're all equal, but some are more equal than others. And it was a kind of privilege in being the kind of people who could both point the finger, but then also had greater latitude as far as what they could say. Um, and what was interesting is that when Atia finally was in the actual letter that was circulated, her firing wasn't because she said something mean about Charlie Kirk. It was because she said she was using white male in a highly pejorative way repeatedly. And was basically saying like you are, so she was kind of getting finally hoisted by her own petard. This kind of, if we're going to say you can't talk about, you can't use these kinds of classifications in a multiracial society this way, well, that applies to you as well. So now we're
Mhm.
getting more into the object level question. What should people be allowed to say? Not legally, but institutionally and socially.
Yeah, I mean, something there's so many things about that story that I find interesting because, on the one hand, opinion writer to opinion writer, I think, you know, like, well, it made me think that there is just something weird about the whole role of an opinion writer where you're both like paid to share your opinions, but also they better be opinions that fall within certain parameters or and you have to kind of always guess what those are. So that is a weird thing about that type of role. And it's not the same as being like a tenured professor because it attracts the sort of person who wants to say all sorts of things, but also like there are these parameters and if somebody doesn't want to post your columns they don't get posted, right? Or well, I mean, there's Substack now, but that's yeah, something else. But what I would have thought that what would have gotten her in trouble was attributing a quote to Charlie Kirk that was not accurate. Which, where she had she had posted that he had said something about Black women, like, as a class, like, people, and it was about a certain listed group of Black women. It wasn't a I listened. I watched whatever this was, like a video podcast type thing. I watched the part of it in question. I did not find it pleasant. I did not think it seemed nice. He didn't say the thing she said he said, and I would have thought that that journalistically would have been more concerning because she put it in. She like quoted him, like she said that he had said this, but apparently that wasn't it. But what do you think, though, in terms of like, is anybody, so should we be looking for the purist, like the person who's pro free speech across the board? Because okay, why not?
Nobody is pro free speech. And, there have always been, the question is kind of what kind of speech can you have and what kind of speech do we want to have? I mean, nobody, for example, look, for example, like my kids are not allowed to curse or use racial slurs at the table. They're not allowed to do that at all, as far as I have any control over that. And that is true, I think, for pretty much anybody in, at an office, anyone at a school. We do have, of course, we have guideline, restrictions around speech for leaving aside the legal question, because the legal and constitutional question does have to be much broader. It's Gesellschaft versus Gemeinschaft, the question of community and society. But we operate in something more like communities, which do have, tighter and more restrictive norms because otherwise they can't possibly function. And one of the things that happened, I think basically starting around 2012 or so, or maybe even before, the norms started to go haywire. Particularly in, I think, some of the more influential cultural institutions that we have. And we're still sort of coming around to a correction of that. But I don't think it's useful to say like, well, some of us are free speech and some of us aren't. That's not really, which may be true in a broad sense, but it just doesn't get us very far because almost nobody just thinks it should be a free for all. I mean, just for example, like, I don't think I would not want any major or important institution to be employing Candace Owens. What is the value of having someone like that? Or Nick Fuentes? I mean, there are people who, you would never say, well, we got to hear both sides. We need to have, Holocaust education, but also Holocaust denial. You really want to have the spectrum. Then you don't want to have the spectrum because that just makes everyone stupid.
It's tricky. I mean, I've been trying to think like, what is the Jewish angle on free speech? Because I think there is sometimes like, as I understand it in certain community forums I learn about from colleagues that I'm not personally in, there's like stuff about like how sort of basically how harshly to crack down on pro-Palestinian speech from people who work in Jewish institutions, things like this. And I tend to be like free speech bro about these things. And like, even if I don't agree with it, like more harm comes from cracking down on it than from just being like live and let live and, just like whatever. But at the same time, I think, you know, the Jews do bear the brunt of like a lot of what one learned with the whole free speechifying of Twitter, now X, is like, what do people say unfettered? What's the first thing they do? I mean, there's one group who seems to really bear the brunt, and you know, hello, like it does seem to be Jews.
No, I mean, look, there's no question Twitter's become uglier and stupider. It has.
Hmm.
I mean, like, it's a dumber place now. It's just much, much dumber.
So,
You
what
know,
upbeat note do you want to end on?
what's the upbeat note? I mean, one thing that's, if you want to taking the Jewish angle, thinking about that, what my biggest concern is that cracking down on free speech around things that are nominally in favor of Jewish concerns, for example, saying you can't say this online. That is used because it's easy, not because it's the best thing to do for Jews. I mean, I'm going to be very blunt now. Um, the thing that I am much more concerned about, major gatherings of people blocking public squares, basically breaking public square laws left and right and getting away with it because they are part of a favored constituency in a place like Toronto or Montreal. I mean, there is no question that pro-Palestinian demonstrations and people, praying in the middle of the street, I mean, at all times, they are abusing. No one else gets to do this. I don't get to sit in the middle. I don't get to go in the middle of the busy intersection and block it because of the thing because I'm upset, about, I disagree with how the latest Beatles albums were mastered or something like that. reissues. These are this is that just not these are privileges that are basically being abused. Because certain political figures don't have the will or the political capital to actually literally just enforce normal laws. So in lieu of enforcing normal laws, we'll start going after these sort of niche cases. We'll say, well, we went after this guy for something they posted. It's easy to go after that guy because he's sitting at home alone.
In
I
a
don't
small
think
town. Yeah. Yeah.
right. I don't think this actually helps Jews. And then of course you have to worry about when will that start getting used in other ways. For example, if a Jewish person says, well, I don't actually think, for example, what happens at residential schools is equivalent to the Holocaust. And I think there's more questions about one of these instances than the other. Okay, well then is that person now going to get hit with some sort of, speech crackdown because they too are engaging in a form of denial.
I mean, yeah, a lot of these tensions do seem to happen when it's like sort of protected groups up against each other.
Yeah, so that it becomes a political battle, not
Mhm.
not not actually a legal or ethical or moral battle. And I
Mhm.
don't see that going well for Jews again, because again, there just aren't that many of them. So it's very
Sure.
hard to really solidify the kind of permanent political capital that will always make sure, even just from a purely Machiavellian standpoint, that the norms will flow in your direction and be conducive to your interests.
Yeah, I mean, I would even say, like, to bring the US back into it. Apologies to the listeners, who don't like when I do this, but to do that all the same, the Trump administration crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech, I don't think has first of all, it hasn't really had the support of that many American Jews, given that American Jews vote Democrat and just aren't into that sort of thing. I don't think that it makes Jews look good, even though it shouldn't have anything to do with that because it's not even Jews leading it. But what's interesting to me living in Canada, as a dual citizen now, is to see parts of the Jewish community wanting more sort of like, let's be tougher on the pro-Palestinian activists. And I just keep thinking like, but in what way? Because there are different ways that could go. And the way of, taking off the street some entirely sympathetic seeming woman in grad school who co-wrote some op-ed, yeah, that doesn't help
I mean,
anybody.
that's why this is why we talk, that you have the term anarcho tyranny. I mean, for say, for example, look, a cop got me for a rolling stop the other day and hit me with a very nasty ticket. I'm easy. I'm an easy guy to go after. Like, trying to track down murderers and, sex traffickers and things like that. That's harder. Cracking down on the dumb grad student who says something stupid is easier than maintaining public order in a kind of large scale way. And so in treating these as victories, I think is a mistake.
Hmm.
These small impositions of authoritarian power that someone say, okay, we got them, and yet meanwhile, the larger society continues to kind of spin out.
Well, this has been your week in optimism at the Jewish Angle with guest David Polansky. Thank you so much for joining me
My
on this
my
podcast.
pleasure. My pleasure. But and
Um,
I never advertised optimism as my brand. I should point that.
nor did I. So it's the two pessimists hour. Thank you so much, and
Thank
come
you.
back anytime. Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.